Caleb Ross bent a mower shaft for the fourth time on the back ridge and shut the machine off. 26 brush-choked acres sat above him. His cattle would not use them. His mower could not handle the rock. 3 days later, a feed store notice offered 4 Spanish-type goats for $32. Caleb pulled the paper down. The clerk looked at him. "You raising goats now?" Caleb folded the notice and put it in his pocket. "No," he said. "I need something that eats uphill." Caleb was 43 and ran a small beef operation in the Ozark foothills of southern Missouri. The farm was 87 acres, but only part of it behaved like useful pasture. The lower ground grew grass well enough when rain came. The back ridge was different. Years of light grazing had allowed thorny brush to take over. The cattle avoided the thickest sections. A tractor could reach some of it, but not safely, and every pass over hidden rock seemed to cost Caleb another blade, belt, or repair. A contractor had already quoted more than Caleb could spare to clear the worst of it with machinery. He had begun thinking of the ridge as wasted land. That was the expensive part. If he could not use those acres, he had to make up the difference somewhere else with rented pasture, hay, or fewer cattle. The goats were not impressive when he picked them up. 4 adult does stood in a small lot behind an old shed. They were narrow through the body, alert, and suspicious of the trailer. They were not show animals. They were not registered breeding stock. The seller was moving and wanted them gone. Caleb paid the $32, loaded them, and drove home. By late afternoon, the goats were standing at the edge of the back ridge. They ignored the grass beside the gate. One stretched upward and stripped leaves from a blackberry cane. Another pushed into a patch of brush the cattle had refused for years. Caleb watched for 10 minutes and smiled. Then the first goat walked straight through a loose section of cattle fence. By dark, 2 were outside the pasture. By sunrise, all 4 were in the yard. The goats had proven 2 things in less than a day. They wanted the brush, and Caleb's fence meant almost nothing to them. His $32 solution immediately required an electric charger, portable netting, better grounding, extra water tubs, and several evenings of work. The equipment cost far more than the animals. That was Caleb's first correction. Cheap livestock did not mean cheap management. He divided the ridge into small temporary paddocks. Instead of turning the goats loose across 26 acres, he concentrated them in one section, watched what they ate, and moved them before the browse was stripped too hard. At first, the change looked dramatic. Leaves disappeared from thorny stems. Narrow paths opened through brush that had been nearly impenetrable. Sunlight reached patches of ground that had been shaded for years. Caleb began taking photographs from the same fence posts every time he moved the netting. He marked each paddock on a paper farm map and wrote down the date. He wanted to know whether the ridge was actually becoming useful, or whether 4 hungry goats were simply making it look different. Then he made his second mistake. One paddock contained a dense wall of brush, and Caleb wanted it finished. He left the goats there longer than he had planned. They ate the easy leaves first, then they worked lower. Then they began revisiting the same plants. The ground around the water tub became bare. One doe began losing condition. A local veterinarian checked the animals and warned Caleb about the part of goat management he had been treating too casually. Goats could use browse that cattle ignored, but they still needed sound nutrition, minerals, clean water, and careful parasite management. Leaving them in the same short-grazed area too long could create problems for the animals as quickly as it created problems for the land. Caleb changed the rotation again. He moved sooner. He rested paddocks longer. He stopped trying to make the goats erase every plant before they left. That decision mattered more than the purchase price. By midsummer, the ridge no longer looked like a cleanup project. It looked like a sequence. Goats entered first and attacked the leafy brush. Then they moved. The paddock rested. Grasses and low plants that had been hidden beneath the canopy had light again. Caleb cut only the thicker stems the goats could not meaningfully suppress. He protected the young trees he wanted to keep. He repaired weak fence before each move. The goats were not clearing the ridge by themselves. They were changing the job. Instead of asking a tractor to grind through rock and brush all at once, Caleb used the animals to remove a large share of the leafy growth, then used his own labor only where it was needed. Late that summer, a dry spell hit the farm. The lower grass slowed first. Caleb had expected the back ridge to become another liability. Instead, the goats continued using woody browse and coarse plants that the cattle still did not want. It did not make the farm drought-proof. Caleb still watched water, body condition, and forage carefully. He still fed when he needed to. But the ridge was finally contributing something during a season when every usable acre mattered. The clearest proof came after Caleb rested one of the larger paddocks for several weeks. He opened a temporary lane and let a small group of cattle follow the goats into it. The cattle did not stop at the old brush line. They walked farther up the slope than Caleb had seen them go in years. The brush was still there, but it was lower and more open. Between the stems, grass had enough room to grow. The cattle could reach it. Caleb stood at the gate and watched them spread out across ground he had been paying taxes on, but barely using. That was when he understood what the goats had actually changed. They had not turned bad land into perfect pasture. They had made a neglected part of the farm available to a different grazing sequence. The distinction kept Caleb from making the next mistake. He did not buy 20 more goats. He did not tear out every shrub. He did not decide that cattle were obsolete. He kept the herd small and used the goats where their browsing behavior gave them an advantage. He followed with cattle only after enough rest. He continued clipping or cutting heavier stems by hand. He checked the goats for condition and parasite problems. He moved water and fence constantly. The method required more attention than mowing, but it required less machinery on the worst terrain, and it gave him a way to use acres that had been contributing almost nothing. Winter exposed another limit. The goats could remove leaves and weaken some brush through repeated browsing, but they did not make mature root systems disappear. When warm weather returned, several of the paddocks flushed with fresh shoots. Some of the same blackberry and woody plants Caleb thought he had beaten were coming back. For a moment, the ridge looked like it was undoing a year of work. Caleb walked the old photo points with the farm map in his hand. The regrowth was real, but so was the difference around it. The new shoots were shorter, the lanes were still open, low forage was visible between the stems. The problem had changed from an impenetrable wall into something he could manage in repeated passes. So he did not start over. He also learned that timing mattered. Fresh regrowth gave the goats a useful target before the stems hardened, and before he was tempted to leave them too long. He brought the goats back through before the regrowth hardened, then moved them again. Where a thick stem continued to dominate, he cut it. Where a desirable sapling had survived, he fenced it out. Where the ground was thin, he shortened the stay instead of demanding a cleaner-looking paddock. That second pass taught Caleb something the first summer had not. The value of the system was not that the goats finished the job. It was that they let him keep pressure on the brush without repeatedly driving heavy equipment across the roughest ground. The ridge would always require maintenance. So would the fence. So would the animals. Caleb could live with that. What he could not afford was pretending that one expensive cleanup would permanently solve a living landscape. By the next growing season, the difference was visible from the gravel road below the ridge. Not a green miracle. Not a restored wilderness, just a hillside with open lanes through the brush, more low vegetation between woody stems, and animals moving through areas that had once been blocked. Caleb began using the ridge as seasonal forage instead of treating it as dead space. On weeks when the lower ground needed rest, the browsing paddocks gave him another option. The extra flexibility did not eliminate his hay bill, but it reduced the pressure to solve every shortage with purchased feed or rented ground. One evening, Caleb's older brother came by while he was moving netting. He watched the 4 original goats climb into a patch of blackberry and begin stripping leaves. "You still calling those $32 goats?" he asked. Caleb laughed. The fence cost more than they did. So did the charger. So did the vet. His brother looked up the ridge. Cattle were grazing a rested strip beyond the next fence line. "Worth it?" Caleb did not answer right away. At the beginning, he had thought the problem was brush. Then he thought the answer was goats. Both ideas had been too simple. The real problem was that he had been trying to make one kind of animal, one machine, and one grazing pattern fit every acre. The ridge had exposed that mistake. The goats gave him another tool, but only after he learned how to use them without asking too much from the animals or the land. At the end of the second season, Caleb cleaned out the cab of his truck and found the old feed store notice folded beneath the seat. The paper was stained with dust and oil. The price was still visible. $32. 4 goats, take all. He carried it into the workshop. On the wall hung his farm map covered with dates, fence lines, and grazing notes. The back ridge no longer had one blank label across it. It had paddocks. Caleb opened his ledger, turned to the page where he tracked usable grazing areas, and looked at the line for the ridge. For years, he had written one word beside it, brush. He crossed it out. Then he wrote a new one, grazable.